Welcome to part 2 of logical typing and logical levels. In this part we want to examine how people can make logical typing errors, and particularly those that span one or two logical levels. These are the ones that can be particularly mischievous, and in NLP terms are the ones that lead often to false cause effects or assumptions about cause effects, and also inappropriate and often very dangerous complex equivalences. Here's a scheme we saw for leader behaviours in part 1. Now let's suppose that a person sees a particular leader, but not on a lot of occasions. But something they do observe about this leader is that the leader learns quickly across disciplines. They might, for example, be very good at learning and applying legal concepts, as well as learning about engineering concepts and project management concepts. They might also be very good at learning some sports and even languages. So they've got a range of disciplines where, for whatever reason, our observer is aware that this leader is good at learning across a number of disciplines. Let's suppose that the other thing that stands out in the observations is that the leader dependably and regularly completes tasks by given deadlines. Now, human beings are interesting creatures in that they often see two things occurring, and they'll make a connection between them even when that connection is not valid. It's certainly valid in some circumstances, and we'll examine those in a moment, to consider that completing tasks by deadline is an example of a behaviour that we could call an efficient behaviour. So it does belong in that set of behaviours called efficient behaviours, along with maintaining a tidy desk, answering emails promptly, and updating a to-do list. But it's not necessarily an example of a behaviour that goes with learning quickly across disciplines. In fact, sometimes learning across disciplines requires a person to take their time to do things. But human beings will do things like this. They'll notice two things about a person and they'll make a connection. So our observer who isn't thinking about logical levels and logical typing might say something like this. Now, completing tasks by a deadline could be an example of a behaviour that indicates the ability to learn across disciplines if, for example, the person was learning new self-organisational skills. And let's suppose they were good at sport, they were good at learning languages, they were good at writing poetry, but they'd never learned good self-organisation skills. And now they've moved into that new area, that new discipline, and in which case completing tasks by a deadline could now be a demonstration that they're learning in this new discipline. But that would be a particular example and probably not so common. What is true is that we can't say this definitely. There may be circumstances where it's true, but it's not a valid and generally acceptable generalisation. The person who says this has made a logical typing error and it's crossed a couple of logical levels. Now let's look at something different, or another aspect of this in particular. We did say that completing tasks by deadline is an example of behaviours that you'd hope and expect to see when somebody's being efficient. But remember, everything depends on context. So using Venn diagrams, we could include completing tasks by deadline in with efficient behaviours, along with being tidy and being doubly punctual. On the right-hand side, we've got a set of behaviours that could be inefficient behaviours. So they could be things like being late for appointment, being very untidy, ignoring deadlines, for example. However, we can also argue a case that completing tasks by deadline in some circumstances could be an inefficient behaviour. If somebody was so keen on completing a task by a deadline that they didn't take the appropriate time to review that the task was still the correct task for the overall outcome in mind, whether there were any refinements to the way the task was being done should be made. So if they weren't taking that review time or that reassessment time, they might end up with a task that doesn't produce the results and therefore it would be inefficient, doesn't produce the desired results. So completing tasks by deadline, depending on the context, could be an inefficient behaviour or an efficient behaviour. Incidentally, so could being tidy. If somebody was so fixated on being tidy that they were neglecting other important duties and tasks, then that in that circumstance could become an inefficient behaviour. Let's look at something that's obviously, or hopefully obviously, illogical. We see somebody who eats bananas and we take that to mean that he's emotionally intelligent. Here's a proposed scheme that's logically consistent for the concept of a healthy life. It involves, for example, or could involve, developing emotional intelligence and those other things there. Let's look at balances living. That might include these things. And that's all a reasonable proposition. And eating healthily could include these things, and there are the bananas down on the bottom right-hand corner. Now let's suppose our onlooker notices that we have somebody who appears to be very emotionally intelligent and is continuing to develop their emotional intelligence, and that they also eat bananas. And they make a connection. It's easy to see that somebody who eats bananas isn't necessarily emotionally intelligent. They could be, but eating bananas could also be in the behaviours of somebody who has very, very low emotional intelligence. Now, while that's an extreme example, let's look at something that is a little bit more subtle and more realistic. We see somebody who's got good rapport skills, and they say that means she must be a good manager. He or she must be a good manager. Is this necessarily true? Well, let's propose a scheme for a good manager. Here are some things that we might hope, behaviour sets we might hope to see for a good manager. And communicating effectively, in NLP terms, would include good meta-modelling, ability to detect values and beliefs and respond to them, and the ability to create and maintain rapport. There are more things than that, but these would be three ones that stand out. And rapport, of course, we know we do things like pace culture, we pace behaviours, and that includes matching and mirroring, and we lead appropriately. So a good manager, this person says, oh, okay, we would hope that a good manager would be able to create and maintain rapport. But does the ability to create and maintain rapport necessarily mean they're a good manager? For example, can you imagine somebody who might be very good with rapport skills but very bad at decision making? Presumably you answered yes. So this connection that we're showing now is not necessarily a valid one at all. Creating and maintaining rapport could be in the behaviour set of a good manager, but they also, and almost certainly are, in the behaviour set of a good con artist. Now, just because somebody creates and maintains rapport doesn't mean we can say what just appeared at the top of the screen. If somebody was going to be a good con artist, you'd expect that somewhere in their communication skills they'd be good at creating and maintaining rapport, but they might be very bad at judging other aspects of things that are needed to be a good con artist. Creating and maintaining rapport means the person could be a good con artist, but we need a lot of other evidence to decide that they really are. And we can see that if, under this scheme, that creating and maintaining rapport is one aspect of communicating effectively, but if somebody's not showing adaptive behaviour, they'll make neither a good manager nor a good con artist. This scheme's interesting, by the way. It's not just for a good manager, it could be for a good team leader. It could be generally for a good leader. It could also be a scheme we could say applies to an ethical salesperson. And we definitely hope, in NLP terms, that it applies to somebody who is a great coach. So, when you perceive causality, or somebody else suggests causality or equivalence, and you accept it, check your logical typing.